Hello and welcome, my name is Racho and today I am here with Hildryn's new augment and buffs that she got. We're going to cover her kit and we're going to cover all that's changed and how she is much better now. She got some massive buffs. I know I'm a bit late to the party with this one, but Hildryn was always on my list of things to do and cover. With the new update, I just wanted to cover her after the major reworks and new Warframe, so she was a bit delayed compared to some other YouTubers that already made builds for her. So we're going to get right into it and we're going to cover Hildryn's passive. So Hildryn is a bit of an interesting Warframe. She doesn't have any energy. Instead, she uses her shields in order to actually cast her abilities. This includes any Helminth abilities. Because of this, she actually has the largest shield value in the entire game. And she also has a 3.5 second shield gate regardless of what her max shield value is, which is much higher than which is 1 whole second higher than what any other Warframe can have typically, except for Protea, which would be only 2.5 seconds. Additionally, since she doesn't have any energy, picking up health orbs will give her a tiny bit of shields instead. Energy orbs. And lastly, if she has overshields active, Toxic will not be able to bypass her shields. So Toxic will still bypass her shields if she doesn't have overshields, but overshields will stop the bypass effect of Toxic, preventing it from being able to be one-shot, making Hildryn and all Overguard frames plus Revenant the only Warframes in the game that can actually not be one-shot by Toxic. Hildryn's first ability is her exalted weapon named Balefire. It is a secondary weapon that has an explosive shot that has pretty bad crit damage, crit chance, status chance stats, but pretty decent actual raw damage stats. Just touching the ability will fire out one shot, but you can also hold charge the ability to fire out a much more powerful shot. The first shot will only do 500 damage, but the hold charge will do full 1500 damage, and it does entirely electric damage. The crit chance for the weapon is only 5%, while the status chance is only 10%, and the crit multiplier is only 1.5. Hildryn's second ability is the famous Pillage, one of the better Helminths in the game. Pillage will send out an aura around Hildryn. Any allies, including Hildryn, that enter within this aura will have all negative status effects stripped. Additionally, allies that are within this aura will have their shields or armor stripped by 25%. This does scale of power strength, meaning you need a total of 400 power strength in order to fully strip enemies' armor with a single cast, or 328% if you're using corrosive projection. Note that I did say shields or armor. This means that Pillage cannot strip both shields and armor with a single cast. If enemies have shields and armor, you must get rid of their shields first before Pillage is able to actually strip their armor. The most obvious example, the best example of this would be Acolytes. If you're wondering why Pillage isn't stripping Acolytes, it's because you have to get rid of their shields first before it will strip their armor. Additionally, when Pillage deactivates because it ran out of duration, or when you recast the ability, forcefully deactivating it earlier, it will give Pillage shields and overshields based on the amount of armor or shields that were stripped from enemies, meaning this won't work on any faction type or enemies that don't have shields or armor, mainly infested, and there is a 2-second delay before this actually happens. So you either want to run a small amount of duration for Pillage to work effectively, or you also just have to recast the ability if you're relying on it for survivability. Because of this, Pillage is honestly a bit of a niche ability for the Helminth. It can be very powerful and very good when it works, but I feel like people do overuse it a tiny bit in the Helminth on builds that it doesn't really work on, but hey, that's a different rant for a different time. I totally forgot to mention the Augment for Balefire. The Augment for Balefire will recover 250 shields on fully charged shots, and if it makes contact with Nullifier Bubbles, it will destroy the Nullifier Bubble and restore your shields by 750. The Helminth for Pillage does not work on the Helminth version of it because it only works when Haven, which is Hildryn's third ability, is activated, will deal heat damage on enemies that are caught within the range, also with a guaranteed status effect. Haven is Pillage's third ability. It will deal constant radiation damage over time to all enemies within range, not really doing much damage, nothing to note of. However, allies that are also within range while Haven is activated, and you'll notice it is a channeled ability, will gain increase maximum shields, as well as their shield gate will be increased to 3.5 seconds, just like what Hildryn's is. Haven does not have an augment for itself, however Haven is needed to work with Pillage's augment. Hildryn's fourth ability is somewhat similar to Jade's fourth ability. Pillage will fly up into the sky having Archwing controls, and have an aura around her. Enemies that are caught within this aura will be suspended and completely crowd controlled, and they will also generate energy orbs every few seconds. While this aura is activated, Pillage will have a constant shield drain over time. Additionally, while this aura is activated, Balefire is the only weapon that Hildryn is allowed to use. Now, this ability has gotten quite a few buffs since the update. Previously, when you would cast this ability, you would need to also separately cast Balefire in order to actually activate it. And you would not be able to activate Pillage or any Helminth ability while this ability was activated. Now, when you cast her 4th ability, Balefire will be automatically activated for you. You can recast the ability if you want, but you won't be able to use any other weapons, so there's no real point of doing that. Additionally, you can now also cast Pillage and Helminth abilities while this ability is activated. This ability got one last buff in the way of its new Augment, that will give Balefire an ult shot that will fire out 4 consecutive blasts, which will gain additional damage which will fire out 4 consecutive blasts and will also gain 50% of Hildryn's max shields as damage before mods, making it a much more powerful weapon, making it do a lot of damage. Okay, so the build. This build is a build for her 4th ability using the new Augment, which does a stupid amount of damage. And as you can see, it's pretty simple. That's pretty much the run and the short of it. Simply just have your 4th ability activated, use the ult fire on Balefire to do a stupid amount of damage, and cast Pillage as needed, both for survivability and also to regen your shields, as that is your energy in this case, and cast the Helminth ability, which is Xata's Whisper, whenever it deactivates. We are using Xata's Whisper, as Xata's Whisper is the best Helminth ability in the game when it comes to raw damage. This is because Xata's Whisper is a final damage buff, meaning it's multiplicative with everything, unlike Raw, which is additive with faction mods, and also unlike Eclipse, has additional buffs that makes it a lot better than Eclipse. Unlike Eclipse, Xata's Whisper doesn't actually buff your weapon's damage. What it actually does is it gives your weapon a second damage instance, essentially giving you multi-shot, and that scales on every single hit that the weapon does. So if your weapon has 3 multi-shots, it will now do the normal 3 shots the weapon does and the 3 shots that Xata's Whisper does, technically doubling your multi-shot. Xata's Whisper will not only scale off strength, but it will also scale off the mods on your weapon. And most importantly, Xata's Whisper will double dip with faction mods, meaning it will give a massive damage buff when paired with faction mods. Moving on to the builds now, I do have 2 Tower Forged Red Shards here, just both for 15% extra ability duration, just to tie me over to make the build a bit more comfortable. This isn't needed, but it does make the build just a bit nicer, as we'll use a bit less shields while we're in our 4th ability. And I did Helminth over her 3rd ability as it's not needed for this build. Now onto the Hildryn build. I keep calling her Pillage. The Hildryn. So Corrosive Protection is the aura I'm using. Not only does this work very well with Pillage, this means I can strip enemy armor with a lot less, as normally Pillage needs 400 power strength to fully strip armor, or 328 with Corrosive Protection. This means I need a lot less strength to actually fully strip enemies. However, this setup will not fully strip enemies anyway. The reason being is because after the damage cap from Jade Shadows a few months ago, fully stripping enemies is entirely unnecessary, and this build does a lot of damage, so you really don't need to full strip enemies. Pillage is honestly mostly used to bring us our shields back so we can actually stay in our 4th ability, and not as much for the armor stripping of enemies. We do obviously have primed redirection. Of course you want this on Hildryn, because not only does it give her more survivability, it also increases her energy pool, and it also increases the damage of Balefire with this new Augment. So definitely want prime redirection. If you don't have prime redirection, obviously regular redirection will work, but it's not going to work as well. So the next time primary direction comes around, I highly recommend picking it up. Adaptation will give us an extra bit of survivability, as shields themselves do have a 50% damage reduction, but adaptation will further increase that by 90%, giving us the 95% damage reduction. Strength and range. Balefire is an AoE weapon with a 3-meter AoE. And the AoE has no damage fall off, it goes through walls, and it scales off both range and mods like Fulmination on the actual weapon itself. And those two range and Fulmination scale multiplicatively. So range is massive for Hildryn, because it's going to make Balefire do a stupid amount of damage with a very big AoE that has no damage fall off and goes through walls. So yes. Then obviously we do have Transient Fortitude and Umbra Intensifier for strength, not only to increase the damage that Balefire does, but also to just armor strip enemies a bit more effectively with Pillage. And then Multi-Augmented would give us a further 60% power strength, which will further increase the damage of Balefire. We do have Streamline once again, just to make the build a bit more flexible, as it will lower the cost of each shot of Balefire, as each time we shoot Balefire, it will consume some shields, and obviously her third ability will consume shields over time as well. Since we are using Transient Fortitude, we would normally have negative duration, which is why I have the 2 duration shards. The 2 duration shards plus Streamline work very well in order to lower the drain of Aegis Storm, making it a much more fluid playstyle, and you have to be less worried about your shields running out and constantly spamming Pillage to make sure that doesn't happen. And then obviously we have the Augment Aegis Gale itself, which is the Augment for Aegis Storm. Arcane Velocity on hit will give us a 90% chance to increase the fire rate of our secondaries. This is definitely needed because the fire rate of Balefire, even with this augment, is very, very slow. So to increase the damage a lot, you definitely want as much fire rate as you can get your hands on. Next, let's look at the actual Balefire build. As I said, Prime Fulmination does also increase the AoE of this weapon, and it scales multiplicatively with range, so you definitely 100% need to have Prime Fulmination. Galvanized Diffusion is for our multi-shot, as well as Lethal Torrent, which is for extra multi-shot and fire rate. Then we have our base damage, and even more base damage over here with Magnum Force, and then we have our faction mod and our damage type. So now, since the update in Jade Shadows, you kind of have to, since this is a raw damage build, you kind of have to switch what damage type you're using depending on what faction you're going up against. In my example, I went up against Orokin, hence why I primed Orokin, Expel Orokin, and Orokin the faction are weak to Viral. If you're going up against Grineer and Kuva Grineer, you would run a place Revile with Corrosive. If you're going up against Corpus or Amalgam Corpus, I would use Magnetic. You can use Toxic instead, which will bypass their shields, but there are some Corpus enemies that do have armor, and Toxic won't do a lot of damage, that much damage to enemies, Corpus enemies that have armor. So it's your choice if you want to have Toxic to bypass the shields, or Magnetic, as will work with better against the armored Corpus units, even if they are rare. Infested, you simply just want Heat. Nama, you want Toxic. Deimos Infested, you want Blast or Gas, doesn't matter which. And for Murmur and Sentience, you want Radiation. As I said, Satos Whisper double dips with faction mods. This means that the faction mod will increase the damage of Balefire shots, which Satos Whisper scales off, and then when Satos Whisper's damage is calculated, the faction mod will be factored a second time to increase Satos Whisper damage. So you 100% need a faction mod for the setup, as it will increase the damage it does by a lot. You'll notice that since the weapon has a terrible status chance or crit chance and crit multiplier, I didn't bother modding for any of them, which is why we have a few additive mods here, like the additive damage. Base damage. While I didn't bother to mod for crit chance or crit damage on our weapon, I am using the Adzia Kavat, which will increase the crit damage and crit chance of our weapon, but I didn't want to mod for it because it's still not very consistent, so this is just an extra buff that we can have every now and then, but nothing consistent. How does the Adzia Kavat work? Well, it has the precept mod unique to it called Cat's Eye, which will give us a 60% increase absolute crit chance buff every 10 seconds with a 20-second cooldown. It's important to note that lasts for 10 seconds with a 20-second cooldown, sorry. It's important to note that this ability, the cooldown only starts when the ability runs off, meaning you have the ability for 10 seconds, it runs off, and then you have to wait 20 seconds before getting the ability again. What an absolute crit chance buff means is it's a flat number added to the crit chance of your weapon after mods. For the example of Balefire, it would take our Balefire's crit chance from 5% to 65%. If we were to put on, let's say, whatever a secondary version of Critical Delay is, Critical Delay would increase the 5% of Balefire to 15%, and then Cat's Eye would further increase that to 75%. So it's still not really worth modding that much, which is why I didn't bother modding it for it. And then we are actually also increasing the crit damage of our build, of our Balefire, with Tenacious Bond, which will give us an absolute crit damage buff of 1.2, which will take Balefire's crit damage from 1.5 to 2.7, as long as our companion has 50% or higher crit chance, which it does. Tech Assault will give our companion some survivability, as it will give it a 60% chance to avoid lethal damage and be immune for 4 seconds. Tech Enhance will increase the duration of our companion's abilities by 30%, meaning Cat's Eye will actually last for 13 seconds, not 10 seconds. Reinforcement Bond will give us more fire rate for our weapons, as long as our companion has 1200 max shields or overshields, as you can see it does, which is simply gotten just by having linked redirection, because Hildryn has a ridiculous amount of shields. Synth Deconstruct will give us some extra health orb drops, which is just a nice little bonus to have. Reflect is, as is Kavat's other precept mod, and it's just for added survivability for our Kavat. And then Linked Redirection and Linked Vitality, obviously for the Kavat survivability, and Fetch is a must-have mod For the Preceptor mod, for the weapons of our companion, I am using the Protector Posture mod, which will make the companion prioritize attacking enemies within 15 meters of us, and it will apply 4 puncture procs on every hit it does on an enemy. And what the puncture status effect does is give us a absolute crit chance on any enemy we hit with it, and also reduce the damage of our enemy. With 4 puncture procs, enemies' damage will be reduced by 70%, and we will gain a 20% absolute crit chance buff when we hit that enemies. Meaning with Cat's Eye and attacking an enemy with 4 puncture procs, we will actually have a 85% crit chance, and even without Cat's Eye, we will have a 25% crit chance. Bind will increase the crit chance and crit damage of our Azir and is used to increase this crit chance to above 50% for Tenacious Bond. Then we have Ballerina. Ballerina will knock down enemies whenever they get hit by our Azir and force proc 4 impact status effects, which isn't that amazing on its own, but what this mod does, Magnetic Strike, will change those magnetic status effects into impact status effects into magnetic. The mod suggests that it would apply magnetic on top of the impact, but it actually replaces the impact for magnetic, which is a bit upsetting. But this is very good as it will increase the damage you do to shields and also overguard. We have precision conditioning, which will change the physical damage type of our companion to slash, while also increasing the base damage of it by 315%. Shocking Claws, which will change the elemental damage type of our weapon to electric and increase our status chance by 270%. Swipe, which will make our companion hit enemies 4 times. Call the Weak, which is basically CO but for our companion, as it will increase our companion's damage by 60% for each status type effect on them, and will also increase the base damage even more on non-critical hits. And then finally, Bloodthirst, which will heal our companion each time whenever they attack an enemy afflicted with Slash. This is not set up for raw damage, this is set up for pure utility, and still with this setup, the companions can actually do quite a lot of damage, because Beast Companions now do quite a lot of damage. Lastly, we have our utility weapons. It doesn't really matter what you're running, but I highly recommend running a weapon from the Furix family, so you can use Amalgam Furix Body Count because of its effect, which gives you a 45% additional fire rate to your secondary weapons. So you get the fire rate from Arcane Velocity, from Lethal Torrent, from Amalgam Furix Body Count, and also from Reinforcement Bond. The movement speed of Hildryn's fourth ability is scales of movement speed, not sprint speed, so things like Amalgam Serration will not increase the movement speed of her fourth, and also Amalgam Barrel Fusion, because you aren't rolling in her fourth, will not also increase your roll speed, so you don't need a mod for those, use those mods on this setup, but so you can run literally whatever you want with your primary or secondary weapon. Something you should know, however, that if you have your secondary weapon equipped before you go into your fourth ability, you will not be able to activate the Alt-Fire. This is simply fixed by deactivating Balefire and then recasting it, or simply by just not having your secondary equipped when going to activate her fourth ability. For the focus skills, you can honestly run anything you want except for Naramon. I personally am running Vazarin because Vazarin will give me a period of iframes using the Protective Sling effect, which will give me 5 seconds of invulnerability, which is important because if my shields do go down because of enough damage I've taken from enemies, my shield gate is only 3.5 seconds and the shield delay from fully drained is 4 seconds. So if I don't have, I'm using Protective Sling there to give me additional iframes to wait so my shields can actually restore, as I can't use energy with shield conversion mods like Organ mods to give me back my shields because I don't have any energy, and you basically have to wait for your shields to restore enough to you can activate Pillage, which will then fully restore your shields. But if you don't want to use Vazarin, you could also use Xenoric for some extra power strength. Besides that, Xenoric isn't really useful for this setup either. I'd much rather recommend doing Mata Ray, as you'll get more power strength from it and it'll be easier to do. Mata Ray will also increase your casting speed. And you could use Unaro for Armor Strip, which you don't need because you already have an Armor Strip. And you also don't need it for its knockdown resistance effect either, because you're flying and you don't get affected by knockdown when you're flying anyway. So really your choices are Mata Ray and Vazarin. Naramon also isn't useful because you're not using a melee. Anyway, that is all I have for today's build. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have a lot of fun playing with Hildryn because she is so powerful now, and she can kill enemies very well, and her Augment plus the usability changes that added to her kit were massive buffs. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, do leave me a like and a subscribe, and check out some of my other videos. I've done some guides on Koumei, Nova's rework, and also Caliban's rework, so if you want to check out those videos, go ahead and do that too. And until next time, bye bye!